Welcome, everyone, to this workshop on the twin existential threats of climate change and nuclear war. My name is Ira Helfand. I'm going to be the facilitator for this group. We're very fortunate to have as our speaker Alan Robach, who is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University. He is the author of more than 400 scientific articles about various aspects of climate science, and was one of the pioneers in the 1980s in the original research identifying the phenomenon of nuclear winter following nuclear war. More recently, over the last 15 years or so, he and Brian Toon and some of their colleagues have been the leaders of a large international effort among climate scientists, which has reaffirmed the findings and deepened our understanding of the danger of nuclear winter following nuclear war, and perhaps more importantly, has identified for the first time that disastrous climate effects would follow even a more limited nuclear war. This research played a pivotal role in getting countries to support and sign on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And for this work, Alan has been nominated repeatedly for the Nobel Peace Prize. We have a very large group today. Alan's going to be showing some slides after his presentation. We'll take questions and answers. I will ask you to type your questions into the chat function, and I'm going to read the questions to Alan so we can try to get through as many as we possibly can. We will try to get to all of your questions if that's possible. Alan, the floor is yours, please.
So thanks very much for inviting me to give this talk. And I'm going to talk about the climatic and humanitarian impacts of nuclear war. I'm from Rutgers University, which is more than 250 years old. And what this means is that, like many other schools that started back then, the namesake of Rutgers, Henry Rutgers, owned slaves, as did early presidents of Rutgers, and slave labor built our campus. The land on which Rutgers sits was stolen from the Lenni Lenape natives, and we benefit from the Morrill Act, which is called the Land Grant Act, but what that meant is we were able to sell land taken from Native Americans for the benefit of Rutgers. So I've become a lot more aware of these things in the last year. So these are we're trying to be more diverse, but these are a bunch of old guys. And it turns out that when we first did our work in nuclear winter, that was 30 years ago, and we weren't so old, we were in our 30s, but that's what we look like now. So this is taken a year ago. Rich Turco, Brian Toon, Tom Ackerman, who wrote the TAPS paper, me, and Georg Existential, who wrote the first Russian work on this. But our team now includes a lot of younger people. Cheryl Harrison and Nikki Lewandowski are oceanographers. Julie Lundquist models fires. Lily and Jonas model crops. And Mike, Chuck, and Josh model climate. So this is part of the team that we're working with. Here's a story. This is the Earth, but after a nuclear war, it would look like this, with clouds of smoke covering the planet, moving to the southern hemisphere, blocking out the sunlight. If there was enough smoke, temperatures would get below freezing, even in the summertime, and we call this nuclear winter. And it would be cold, dry, and dark at the surface. There'd be more ultraviolet radiation because ozone would be destroyed, and this would mean crops would die, and it would produce global famine. If the US and Russia had a nuclear war, there would be so much smoke that almost everybody on Earth would starve to death. Here's a graph of the total number of nuclear weapons on the planet. And you can see that during the arms race, the number kept going up and up and up. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons, but this is the total. The US and Russia have more than 90% of them. So why did the arms race end? Well, in 1982, Paul Crutzen and John Birx wrote a paper reminding us that there would be smoke from fires. And then an American group, Turco, Toon, Ackerman, Pollack, and Sagan, and a Russian group, Alexander Konstanchikov, calculated what the climate response would be, and they found temperatures would get below freezing, and that it would be a nuclear winter. And then I did a paper, and another group did, and then the arms race ended. And as scientists, we do our research by running models, looking at data, but historians just ask people what they did. By the way, the Soviet Union didn't end 5 years later. That wasn't what caused the arms race. And even though the number has been going down, we still have almost 10,000 deployed nuclear weapons. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are the ones that decided to end the nuclear arms race. Reagan said, a great many reputable scientists are telling us such a war could just end up in no victory for anyone because we would wipe out Earth as we know it. Think back to natural calamities back in the last century, 1800s volcanoes. We saw the weather so change, there was snow in July in many temperate countries, and they call it the year in which there was no summer. So that's the nuclear winter that scientists have been talking about. And Gorbachev said models made by Russian and American scientists show that a nuclear war would result in a nuclear winter that would be extremely destructive to all life on Earth. That knowledge was a great stimulus to us. That was a long time ago. It was almost 40 years ago. Why are we even bringing it up now? So I want to ask these two questions. Although the Cold War and the arms race are over, could the remaining nuclear arsenal still produce nuclear winter with temperatures going below freezing from the smoke generated from cities that would burn? And as you know, there's now 7 more countries that have nuclear weapons. What if a couple of them had a war using many fewer weapons than Russia and the United States? What would happen? And the answer is yes, we could still produce nuclear winter with our current arsenals. And if, say, India and Pakistan had a nuclear war, the temperatures wouldn't get below freezing, but there would be huge climate changes. The direct effects, of course, would be horrible from blast radioactivity and fires, but the smoke would be lofted up into the stratosphere above which, where there's rain, so it would last for years, be blown around the world and cause global agricultural impacts for a decade. So during the first nuclear war, the United States dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, a 15 kiloton bomb. That's 15,000 tons of TNT, and it killed about 150,000 people. And this is the airplane that did it, the Enola Gay. There's a picture I took at the Smithsonian in their warehouse. And this is the model of the little boy uranium bomb that they dropped on Hiroshima. This is a photograph taken of the mushroom cloud from the bomb. And this picture on the right is often shown as the mushroom cloud, but it's not. This was taken 3 hours after the attack. And what it is a pyrocumulonimbus. It's a smoke cloud generating a thunderstorm, which pumped the smoke high up in the atmosphere, up into the stratosphere. And this is what would happen from cities burning, and this smoke would go up in the atmosphere and spread around the world. This is what one of the survivors remembers, is the fires. And this is what Hiroshima looked like afterwards. All the wooden buildings burned. 3 days later, we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki. It was called Fat Man. It was a plutonium bomb. And I took this picture in the museum there. So there's a picture of Fat Man and the bomb. And this is the mushroom cloud from the Nagasaki. It was about 20 kilotons. And this is what Nagasaki looked like afterwards. So now there's about 13,410 nuclear weapons, not 2 as there were 75 years ago. And this figure shows this wedge here is the US, this is the Russian ones, this little wedge is the other 7 nations. I'm going to blow this up so you can see it better. The US and Russia each have about 6,000, but these other countries have a couple hundred. Why did they decide to only stop at a couple hundred? If you want to use threatened nuclear weapons as a deterrence, you only need 1 weapon to drop on the capital of your enemy. So hundreds are more than enough. They could build as many as they want. So why do the US and Russia keep thousands and thousands? This is a satellite picture taken from the space station. And this line here is the border between India and Pakistan. And all these lights are cities. And so these are huge cities which could burn if there was a nuclear war between nuclear India and nuclear Pakistan. So we asked the question, what if India and Pakistan had a nuclear war? Brian Toon and Rich Turco ran into me at the American Geophysical Union meeting, and they said 15 years ago, we calculated how much smoke there would be. And I said, who's going to calculate the climate response? They said, well, we thought maybe you could, and that's what we did. You can imagine a skirmish there, which are happening all the time, getting out of control and starting a nuclear war. And this map shows the line of actual control, which is the border between China and India. In the last year, there's been a lot of skirmishes there too. So you can imagine maybe even India and China having a nuclear war. So we took a climate model, that same kind of computer program that's used to do weather forecasts, and we put in 5 million tons of smoke from the use of 100 total 50 on each side, nuclear weapons from India and Pakistan. And here's a movie I made of the calculation. The smoke we've blown around the world. And on the left is a graph of the vertical distribution. This black line is the tropopause. We live down here in the troposphere where there's rain that washes particles out of the atmosphere, but the smoke would be heated by the sun, lofted up into the stratosphere where there's no rain, and it would be blown around the world and last for years. The temperature change from this, I've plotted on this graph of global warming, which is an important problem. And temperatures, it was to be instant climate change to temperatures unprecedented recorded human history. And this is from using only less than 1% of the current global nuclear arsenal. Other modeling groups did this too, and Mike Mills had, and they got the same result, and he has better graphics. So this is a graph he made of the smoke. And so this is the North Pole and the South Pole, the troposphere where we live, the stratosphere. And in the summer, the dates across the top here, the suns in the Northern Hemisphere will be heat the smoke and lofted up to the top of the stratosphere. And then as it gets to Southern Hemisphere summer, the smoke moves into the Southern Hemisphere. But this is a logarithmic scale, so there's almost no smoke going into the troposphere, and it will last for years. But the situation's much worse than that. This is a Trident nuclear submarine, and they have much bigger weapons than we used in that simulation. They have 100 or 500 kiloton weapons, and they can hold 100 of them. So one of these is as powerful as 1,000 Hiroshimas. And the US has 14, and that's less than half of our arsenal. So that's 25,000 Hiroshimas, and Russia's got the same. So it's 50,000 Hiroshimas, not 100. In the 1980s, there was a question, was nuclear winter real? But we took a modern climate model, went back and did the calculation, and we put in either 50 or 150 million tons, teragrams of smoke instead of 5. And this could be put in the atmosphere today with the current arsenal. And we don't know what scenario might result in the smoke going in the atmosphere, so we also did a simulation of just 50 million tons. And this is a movie I made of that situation. Much thicker smoke blowing around the world, again, lasting for years. And if you take a map of what the temperature change would be a year later in the Northern Hemisphere summer, this is the temperature change, huge changes. And if you take a spot in the breadbasket of the Ukraine, this is a graph of the temperature. So the black is the minimum temperature that you would get without smoke. And it gets really warm in the summer at 25 Celsius, like 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This is freezing, and it gets below freezing in the winter. If you put smoke in, the temperature would get below freezing and last below freezing for at least a couple of years. So clearly it's nuclear winter. Clearly all agriculture would be canceled there. And the same thing in the middle of North America. If I plot the temperature change now on this graph of global warming, I've got to rescale it because the temperature change would be so low. For 50 teragrams, you get 3 degrees Celsius. For the standard case, temperature is 7 or 8 degrees colder. And just a reminder, 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, when huge glaciers were covering North America, the global average temperature was 5 degrees colder. So this is instant climate change to ice age conditions. We calculated what this would do to crops. So the nuclear winter situation with 150 million tons, all the crops die, it's a simple calculation. But what about the war between India and Pakistan? So we asked a bunch of crop modeling groups around the world to calculate how crops would change. And this is a figure for corn, maize, for 5 million tons of smoke in the atmosphere. And the global average reduction would be about 13%, but it wouldn't be everywhere. In Canada, the United States, in Europe, in Russia, Ukraine, there would be huge reductions of corn. And in China too. So places where no bombs were dropped, it would have a huge impact. But our most recent analysis, because India and Pakistan have more nuclear weapons and they're a little bit bigger, we think a war between them could put a lot more smoke in. So we looked at for 16 million tons of smoke. And this now would have even larger impacts, 34% reduction of corn, and the answer is similar for other crops. And so this would be a huge food catastrophe for the whole world, not just from a war between India and Pakistan. So a nuclear war between any nuclear states using much less than 1% of the current nuclear arsenal could produce climate change unprecedented in human history. Such a so-called small nuclear war would reduce food production by 10 to 40% for a decade, with massive increases in ultraviolet radiation. Nuclear winter theory is correct. The current arsenal can still produce nuclear winter, producing global famine, and it will last for more than a decade. So what do we do about it? I'm just going to end up by talking a little bit about treaties. So the world has we heard talks about that this morning, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the New START Treaty was signed by Barack Obama and President Medvedev, and it committed the US and Russia to having 1,550 warheads per side. But because bombers count as one, that's about 2,000 weapons per side. And thankfully, in the President Biden in his first week extended it for another 5 years, so it lasts until 2026. But this is the only nuclear weapons treaty that still exists between the US and Russia. And it maintains this high number of weapons. It doesn't work on reducing them. That's the next step. And the weapons in this treaty can still produce nuclear winter. There are a lot of treaties that prohibit nuclear weapons in different places: outer space, Antarctica, Latin America. And if you look at this map, every country in blue here has no nuclear weapons. There are no nuclear weapons in the Southern Hemisphere. Kazakhstan got rid of them as soon as they could because they had terrible damage from the Soviets testing weapons there. Mongolia has none. There's one country in the Western Hemisphere, the US. There's two in Europe, Britain and France, and there's 6 in Asia. And these yellow and orange ones sort of think that the US is protecting them. But as we heard this morning from Beatrice Finn, and based on our work, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was passed in the UN in 2017, and it just entered into force on January 22nd this year. And so Brian Toon, who's on this call, and I looked at our results, and we said, you know, nuclear countries claim that they keep their weapons, not to use them, but for deterrence. So that means if you attack us, we're going to attack you with our weapons. But if we attack Russia with our weapons, and they didn't do anything, or if they attacked us with their weapons, everybody in the country that attacked would die because of the climate response. That's the 50 teragram case, or 75 teragrams. So if you believe in deterrence, that means you believe that another country would be acting as a suicide bomber. It makes no sense, no sense. So really what we have is self-assured destruction, which is sad, not mutual assured destruction. The deterrence clearly doesn't work for attacks by non-nuclear attacks. There's many examples of this. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe when the US was the only nuclear country. Israel was attacked in the Six-Day War. Britain was attacked in the Falkland Islands. Who won Afghanistan and Vietnam Wars? And it also doesn't deter attacks from cyber warfare or from pandemics. But we want them to deter other nuclear countries. Well, there hasn't been a war between nuclear countries, but why? Was it deterrence or was it something else? Was it the general decline in violence, increased number of democracies, our interdependence? But even if you believe in deterrence, that means it has to work perfectly forever. Because once a nuclear weapon is used, that will start more nuclear weapons and it will be a catastrophe for the whole planet. There's many cases when we came very close to having a nuclear war. I'm just going to talk about one during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and a Soviet submarine was off the coast of the United States, and they were about to launch a nuclear torpedo because they were getting depth charges from US ships. And the third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, the Communist Party boss, said, no, I'm going to counteract the order of this submarine captain. And he's considered one of the men who saved the world because he single-handedly prevented a nuclear war. So how many other, and there's tens of incidents that we know about, including Bill Perry was woken up in the middle of the night. He's the US Defense Secretary. Call the president, we're under attack, and they'd put a training tape in rather than real sensors. Or looking at a Norwegian rocket, the Russians thought they were being attacked. So, and how many other incidents were kept secret? How much longer can our luck hold out? So this is in Russia, there were 36 weapons with, in Cuba, I'm sorry. I took this picture out in Havana, in a park there. There were 36 rockets with 36 nuclear warheads. Each one was a megaton, 77 times more powerful than Hiroshima. And fortunately, it ended without a war. So unfortunately, in the last administration, it was nuclear arms control in reverse. Trump took us out of the Iran nuclear agreement. Biden's working to put us back in. He canceled the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, took us out of the Open Skies Treaty, even talked about having a new nuclear test, which US and Russia haven't done for decades, but the House stopped that and declined to extend the New START Treaty, which Biden did. So peace prizes, Nobel Peace Prizes have been given for work. And so I'd just like to highlight too, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, of which Ira Helfand, our host, is a member and a leader, and ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which we heard from Beatrice Finn this morning, and for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. That's the direct effects, of course, we heard from Hibakusha, like Setsuko Thurlow, but also from the indirect effects based on our work, and for getting the treaty through the United Nations. So when Beatrice accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, she said, the story of nuclear weapons will have an ending, and it's up to us what that ending will be. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons, or will it be the end of us? One of these things will happen. The only rational course of action is to cease living under the conditions where our mutual destruction is only one impulsive tantrum away. So nuclear weapons can be used if they exist. A nuclear war could start tomorrow by accident, hackers, computer failure, bad sensors, or unstable leaders. Nuclear arsenals don't deter attacks from non-nuclear states, terrorists, or pandemics. The only way deterrence would work is if other states believe you're willing to kill yourself and if it will last forever. And the only way to prevent a global catastrophe is to get rid of nuclear weapons. So if the US and Russia got down to 200 or 300 weapons, that would much lower the probability of nuclear winter, although it might still be possible. But we have to get rid of nuclear weapons to prevent nuclear famine. I just mentioned Ira Helfand estimated that a war between India and Pakistan, which he called nuclear famine, might kill 1 to 2 billion people. So finally, Carl Sagan, who was part of the TAPS team, was asked, do you want, really? You really want to get rid of nuclear weapons? And he said, for myself, I would far rather have a world in which the climatic catastrophe cannot happen, independent of the vicissitudes of leaders, institutions, and machines. This seems to me elementary planetary hygiene as well as elementary patriotism. And so I agree that elementary planetary hygiene demands that we eliminate the weapons much faster than the current pace. So Dr. Seuss was in the news, but he said, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So I hope we can continue to keep.
That is the job position number.
Excuse me. This is my last slide. So if I hope we can keep our planet looking like this for a long time to come. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Alan, for a really excellent presentation. I've heard this data many times before, and I find it sobering every time you present it. We are going to take questions. If people can put them into the chat, I will try to read them quickly to Alan so he will have time to answer them. The first question, says that we've known about the climate effects of fossil fuels for some time. Climate activists now recognize that we will not save the planet without much more drastic and urgent action, such as a Green New Deal. What can we learn from climate activists in terms of addressing the threat posed by nuclear weapons, and how can we work directly with them to solve both of these existential threats urgently?
Well, a nuclear war would produce instant climate change, and I think we have to solve this problem before we have the luxury of worrying about gradual global warming. Global warming tomorrow isn't going to be a global catastrophe like nuclear war could. But in both cases, it's economic interests that keep it going. Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. People make a lot of money and a lot of careers on continuing to build nuclear weapons and continuing to sell oil, coal, and natural gas. And so it takes not only scientists talking truth to power, but also mass movements of people telling the government to do the right thing.
Alan, one of the members of the group asks if the slides will be offered to us later.
Yes, I will put a link in the chat right now.
Thank you. Next question, if it has not already been done, please describe the differences between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere with regard to the aftermath of a nuclear war.
The smoke would last so long it would cover the whole world. And so the Southern Hemisphere has a lot more ocean than it does land. And so the temperature of the Southern Hemisphere would cool and warm more slowly. But if you live by a coastline, there would be less climate change, a little bit less than if you live in the interior of a continent. But it would still be catastrophic. People in the 1980s said, well, I'm going to move to New Zealand. That's going to be a good place. It's not going to cool that much. And there's lots of dead sheep around, and we can eat mussels. And so, but there were books written about that. New Zealand would lose all connection to technology. They wouldn't be able to get any medicines they don't make there. And so it still wouldn't be a great place to be. The solution is to not have it in the first place.
Somebody's just pointed out that people don't have access to the chat, and so they can't read the link. At the end of the presentation, we'll open up the chat again so people can get access to the link at that point. What about the false alarm in Hawaii a few years ago? What was done by US military? How close did we come to nuclear exchange by accident then?
That's not, I really don't know. I think it was a warning that but it wasn't, it was somebody made a mistake and put a warning in Hawaii. It wasn't the US military thought that there was an attack. It was somebody messed up. It was a test warning and they put it out by mistake. So I don't think we came close to nuclear war at that time, but it really scared a lot of people. In other words, I don't think it was sensors that saw an attack. It was just somebody typed in the wrong. And you know, nuclear weapons are operated by humans, and there've been many mistakes of people accidentally seeing things or computer programs that fail. And so it's I think we've been really lucky for the last 75 years not to have had a second nuclear war. And we can't continue to, this luck is going to run out at some point if the weapons continue to exist.
One comment that I would just offer, Alan has spoken very powerfully about the way that nuclear war would produce a climate disaster. We are also very concerned about the way that the ongoing progression of climate change on the planet is increasing the chance of nuclear war. And in particular, Zia Mian spoke during the panel about the dangers in South Asia. These dangers are incredibly related to the progression of climate change. The Indus Basin, which is home to about 300 million people in India and Pakistan, is one of the most stressed water resources on the planet. And as climate change progresses, the available water there is going to decline even as the population increases to an estimated 380 million people in the next 30 years. And this is simply, an absolute recipe for disaster. These are two nuclear armed countries that are going to be fighting not about some abstract, difference of theology, but about water, which is absolutely essential to the survival of their populations. And it really underlines the urgency of getting the nuclear weapons off the table, as well as addressing the climate crisis.
I'd like to point out that there's 9 countries with nuclear weapons, but think of all the countries that don't have nuclear weapons who could build them. Why did they decide they'd be better off without them? There's none in the Southern Hemisphere. Brazil and Argentina had programs and they canceled them. They decided they're better off without them. And they have Costa Rica is the only country in Central America without an army, and they're the most successful economically. And so nuclear weapons make a small number of people very rich, but they steal resources from the rest of the country.
A question. In international humanitarian law, there's a customary law applicable to all states, regardless of participation in a treaty, which prohibits weapons which by their nature are incapable of being directed specifically against military objectives, and therefore that put non-combatants at equivalent risk. The USA recognizes this rule explicitly in many of its military manuals. Considering the risk of climate catastrophe by the use of nuclear weapons, do you believe that their use would be contrary to this rule?
Yes, and even before it produces a climate catastrophe, it would indiscriminately kill maybe 1 million people from one bomb in a city, innocent civilians. So the US had a policy of genocide in World War II where they burned more than 60 cities in Japan with incendiary bombs and killed 800,000 people. Curtis LeMay, who started that on March 10th by burning Tokyo, said, we better win this or I'm going to be up on war crimes, which he should have been anyway. He was actually pushing John Kennedy to use nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yes, when we burned Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was already a policy of genocide. They said, well, let's assume that every house has a drill press out back. It doesn't matter killing women and children. Now, I've talked to people in the US military and they say, yes, the law of war says we can't kill innocent people. We can only use weapons against combatants. So we know the effects of blast, we know the effects of radiation, but we really don't know that much about fire. So we're just going to ignore it for now. So Brian Toon and I have this project where we're doing research, and one of the things we want to do, as we discussed this morning, the actual targets are secret, but what we want to do is give the military a tool where they can put in their targets and calculate how much climate change, how many people they would kill by different scenarios, so they won't have no excuse that they would have a plan that would actually make any sense. I mean, I can't even understand why anybody would want to use one nuclear weapon. If you think violence is the way to solve problems, we have cruise missiles and that are very precise. We can attack targets and drones like Biden just did last week in Syria. So I don't particularly believe that violence is the way to solve problems, but if that's your jam, then you can do it without nuclear weapons, without killing lots of innocent civilians.
The next question, Alan, what do you think would happen if one of the NATO members from Europe would join the TPNW?
That would be wonderful. In the Netherlands and Belgium, they've taken polls, and like 80% of the people in the country want them to join it. And in fact, in one of those countries, I forget which, I think it was the Netherlands, they actually approved the treaty. They haven't ratified it yet, but so there's a huge pressure from people in those countries, and that would be great. Ireland has signed the treaty. They're not part of NATO. Yeah, as Beatrice said this morning, the pressure is on them to do that.
Another question, in order to eliminate these weapons, we need to transform the way we think. How do you suggest we affect this transformation of human power and insecurity?
So I do my best to tell people about it, and there were 3 conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear war that ICANN organized before the treaty was passed, in Norway, in Mexico, and in Austria. And Austria signed the treaty, by the way, so has Mexico. I talked at 2 of them. Mike Mills, our colleague, talked at one of them. So we informed, and more than 100 countries in the world know about this, and that's why they were pushed for the treaty. So that's the process. But I was invited to Cuba to give a talk on this, and Fidel Castro sat and listened to my talk. It was a very surreal experience. And they took me on a tour of Havana, and he said, "Can we televise your talk?" And so it was shown nationwide TV the next day in prime time. And we went to a hotel, and there was a Julia Roberts movie on the TV. And I said, "Can you change the channel?" And sure enough, there I was giving my lecture. So what that taught me was that you need a movie with Julia Roberts, or maybe some younger star, a beautiful scientist in St. Petersburg is in love with a handsome scientist in Oak Ridge. And meanwhile, along the Kashmiri frontier, there's a skirmish and a little sex, and they save the world. So you need to engage people's emotions, not just their intellect. So if anybody knows any people that can get feature movies made, that's the way to do it. That's the way to help.
Next question. As nuclear winter is the consequence of nuclear war, are agricultural sector and lobbyists in general on the side of nuclear disarmament? If not, what is stopping the agricultural sector and lobbyists from supporting this initiative? What other major industries and lobbyists support this initiative?
I think because there hasn't been a nuclear war in 75 years, most people don't just ignore it. and pretend it's never going to happen, and they've got much more important things to deal with, like the price of soybeans or the pandemic or getting their kids back into school. And so the question is, can you raise it up to the level where people think it's really important? Even if you hear about it, as Mark Twain said, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. People pretend that they didn't hear it and go on with their lives. So I'm not sure that people have this as one of their major concerns. They just trust that it's not going to happen. So we have to, even though the probability is low, it's not zero. And so that's our struggle to get people aware of it.
What are your views on the effects of the current trends in climate change in raising the probability of a nuclear conflict?
I was talking with Brian Toon about this the other day. It's hard for me to imagine that a country would use nuclear weapons against environmental refugees. So it doesn't seem like the right tool. But as you mentioned, there could be struggles in the Indus Valley for water. One of the ideas of so-called solving the problem is to create a cloud up in the stratosphere like volcanoes do of sulfuric acid droplets. It's called geoengineering, to reflect sunlight. But you can't control the global climate in different places with that. And even if most people would be winners, some people would be losers. And if people start trying to monkey around with the climate on purpose, that might start a nuclear war. So, but I think, as I said, I think we have to solve this problem, and it's instant climate change, but the probability of it is so low that that's why people aren't concerned enough.
And if I could add a thought on that question as well, I think the problem is that climate change is going to just create all kinds of political instability. It's going to lead to large parts of the planet being unable to sustain their current population, which is going to cause mass migration. People would probably not use nuclear weapons on a group of refugees, but those refugees will destabilize countries. There are many people who feel that the current conflict in Syria was essentially a climate war, that the climate change-induced famine in that country in the late 2000s caused huge numbers of refugees to flow into Damascus, and that set the stage for the current conflict. As this,
I think climate change is really destabilizing, but if it gets to Syria doesn't have any nuclear weapons, so to produce a nuclear war would have to be, it's possible, I suppose, but I worry more about an accident. Or, I mean, when Beatrice said that in 2017, there was Kim and Trump, my button's bigger than yours, and so it was really pretty scary. And so I think unstable leaders, computer failures, sensor failures are more likely than gradual climate change. But no matter what, if they don't exist, they can't be used.
A comment, what has not been discussed with regard to stability is the risk that a country with nukes may be taken over politically by people who don't believe in nuclear winter or don't care. Sort of like the United States being governed by somebody who doesn't believe in climate change.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. So yes, so that's possible for sure. And well, it sort of is the situation in the United Kingdom. All their nuclear weapons are in Scotland. They have a Trident submarine base there. The people of Scotland are against nuclear weapons and want to sign the treaty. And they're thinking, well, Brexit shouldn't stop here. Why don't we separate ourselves from Britain, and then we can get rid of our nuclear weapons? And so it could happen the other direction too. So yes, the security of the weapons is a real issue, and people worry about how secure are the weapons in Pakistan, for example.
A question from that reads, Biden is supporting the Space Force. Will nuclear weapons in space be considered?
The Outer Space Treaty prohibits nuclear weapons in space. So you have to ask him about that. I think the Space Force, well, I don't know much about it, but certainly people are thinking about putting not just observations in space from satellites, which are very effective now, but also lasers and things like that. So I don't know much about that.
Under what conditions might the United States move to a world free of nuclear weapons?
There are organizations which have specific plans for how to do this. And, you know, once there's a taboo on nuclear weapons, countries will just get rid of them because they know that they can't use them. There's been a strong enough taboo for 75 years that no matter what happens, nobody has actually used them. Even though during Vietnam, that they were some people were tempted. If you read Dan Ellsberg's wonderful book, he talks about how close we got during the Vietnam War to using nuclear weapons, but we didn't. And so once the numbers go down, you can't uninvent them. You can't make people forget how to make them. But you know, nobody sells buggy whips anymore. If things are not useful, they'll get rid of them. But the politics of that and the psychology of that is sort of other people are experts on that. But there are specific plans for there's an organization called Global Zero, which works specifically on that.
And I think the back from the brink answer to this question is that we need to create in this country a political movement for a fundamental change in US nuclear policy so that the US leadership comes to understand that nuclear weapons do not promote our security, that in fact they are the greatest threat to our security. And we need to get the US leadership to sit down with the Russian and the Chinese leadership and have them all come to this understanding. Um, it is very different than the way they view the world today, but it is actually the correct way to view the world. Uh, and we have the data, we have the science on our side, and that is our challenge. How do we get our leadership to understand that and to commit to a nuclear policy, eliminating the weapons that actually promotes our security?
History shows us that Republican presidents are the ones that have reduced our number of nuclear weapons. President George H.W. Bush did the most when the Soviet Union was falling apart. He reduced our nuclear arsenal without a treaty, and then the Russians followed later. So we were trying to pressure the Obama administration to reduce our nuclear weapons because you don't need a treaty for that. But even though he got a Nobel Peace Prize and said he wants to get rid of nuclear weapons, he didn't do it. It was a real disappointment. I think Democratic presidents can be called weak on communism or whatever if they do things like that. And fear really is a very powerful motive to keep people armed. So it's a real struggle to do that. But we could do that. And why would Iran listen to us to not make nuclear weapons if we keep ours? It's like sitting in a bar telling people not to drink. It's completely illogical. So the non-proliferation treaty takes these 5 countries and say, well, we can keep them, but nobody else can have them. It doesn't make any sense. And the way we treat North Korea, the respect we give them, the concern we give them is sort of a sign that maybe you should have nuclear weapons. So I think we have to just sort of give them up. And if somebody wants to use nuclear weapons on us, go ahead. But it would, what would be the point of that?
So we have come to the end of our allotted time. I want to thank everyone for participating in this, and I especially want to thank Alan for not just the presentation, but for the incredible research that he and Brian Toon and others have done over the years that have had such a huge impact on the international debate about nuclear weapons, and which can, I think, continue to have a huge impact. It's sort of up to us to figure out how to bring this information to the attention of our leaders and get them to change their policies. If any of you are with organizations that are not yet part of Back from the Brink, I would urge you to visit the website preventnuclearwar.org and get involved in this campaign. And thank you all for participating in this event today.
So I put a link to our work, to all our papers, our TED Talks and public information. My name is kind of unusual, so if you just type it into Google, you'll find all my stuff. The United Nations, well, sure. They have this strange structure, though, in the Security Council where there's 5 permanent members who just by chance happen to be the first 5 countries with nuclear weapons. But Beatrice and ICANN were very smart. They put the treaty through the General Assembly, not through the Security Council. And so there was no chance to veto it. That's how it got through. And everybody was shocked that these non-governmental organizations could be so successful when they thought the system was very stable.
Thank you. Thanks. General Assembly doesn't have a whole lot of power of influence, but it's every bit makes a difference.
Yeah, but they got this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons signed, and now it's been ratified. So that was a brilliant politics to do it that way.
Absolutely. Let's keep up the good fight.
It's not the first time that it's not the first time that the General Assembly does something very unprecedented for the United Nations in regards with nuclear disarmament as well. In the 1990s, it was the General Assembly that asked the International Court of Justice for its advisory opinion on nuclear weapons also. So that was a big step. And that was when the court first recognized the customary norm obliging states to negotiate disarmament.
Very true.
Yes, theoretically, the General Assembly is the supreme body, and they delegate security issues to the Security Council, and in particular the 5 permanent members. It's purely the military and political power of those 5 that is the reason why we don't make progress. Why the General Assembly does seem to be powerless, but is not really.
Mm-hmm. It's all very true.
Thank you.
The nation states are taking on a lot of responsibility by choice, and there's a lot more power in the people as long as we keep our voices active and heard. And your presentation, Alan, not just to the leaders of the Security Council or the leaders of nation states, to the people. That's where it belongs. You've got it in a university. Let's share it with, do universities share and train and have teach-ins with other universities? Can we get your material out so that people are talking about it more?
So along with Zia Mian and some others, I'm a member of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And we've going to physics departments around the country. We just started last fall, we will have given 60 talks in different universities. I gave a talk at Oklahoma State University yesterday in Stillwater with Zoom. And we're asking physicists to join us. And we have about 400 people that have joined already. And we have a lobbying arm. The American Physical Society pays full-time staff in Washington to lobby. And last year we lobbied for no initiation of testing again, which Trump was threatening, and also for extension of New START. And those were both successful. And now we're trying to decide which specific things we want to work on this year, which is no first use, no sole authority from the president, turning off the land-based nuclear missiles, which are very unstable, and no first did I say no first use of nuclear weapons? Yeah. So we're trying to decide which of those we're going to focus on and get the agreement of the American Physical Society. And I'm a meteorologist. I'm sort of a honorary member of this. I'm not trained as a physicist, but the physicists, made the bombs, so they have a specific role in trying to get rid of them.
I think one of the reasons why this is so popular at the moment is because you're tying it into the climate crisis. And I think that carries a lot of weight, especially with our young people. And if we can continue to carry, whether it's nuclear winter or nuclear weapons or security issues with the climate and the catastrophe that we're all living under every day, that creates the instability, I think that may be a green light area for making progress.
Yeah, we had lots of trouble getting funding to do our research. From no federal government agency would give us money, and finally the Open Philanthropy Project, which is funded by Facebook billionaires, gave us a grant. We've been working with that money for the last 4 years, and so we were lucky that we were able to get funding to continue our work. But a lot of people, as Zia mentioned, they don't want to hear about it, don't want to know about it. So we're doing the best we can. So if you have any ideas of how to get the information out to the public, that would be great.
How do we contact you, Ira and Alan?
Can contact me through info@preventnuclearwar.org, the email address that Denise shared earlier.
And you can contact me, Roebuck@rutgers.edu.
Do
When
you
you
know?
say, sorry,
Do you know if anyone has contacted Greta Thunberg to ask her to use her influence to reach a wider and younger audience on these issues?
I don't know. I know that we tried to contact Al Gore, the previous generation, and he said no, he wasn't interested in doing it. I contacted Neil deGrasse Tyson and asked him to carry on the legacy of Carl Sagan, who was very influential, and he refused also. So we try to get people who have audiences, but it's hard to get. There are some people in Hollywood who are interested. But it's if you know of any famous people, let us know.
can you say anything about the contributions that are being currently made by the to the climate crisis by maintaining and deploying and so on nuclear weapons?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, all of that activity that protects them and moves them around and so on must be having some greenhouse gas influence, and the industry that extracts the materials that make the bombs and that keep the bombs and keep bombers and
may I comment on that, please?
Sure.
I'm a member of Scientists for Global Responsibility in the UK. I have looked at the participants, and it may be I'm the only person from the UK, but I don't think that there's much direct influence on climate change by nuclear weapons. The things that Alan has been talking about are indirect effects and potential effects in the future. But the so-called conventional weapons, my colleagues have calculated that about 6% of the total effect on climate change is coming from the military expenditure and use, the CO2 emissions by the B-2 bombers and all the rest, and the manufacture and everything. So in terms of direct effects, it's the conventional weapons, but of course, and they are also the ones that are killing people at the present time. So I've been a peace activist for over 70 years, so it's unsuccessful, unfortunately. So we still have that problem, but nevertheless, we are still in the UK trying to make our contribution. And I still, even though I'm 92 years old now, I still hope to have some progress before in my remaining years.
Yeah, the US military, and I guess militaries in the world, are huge consumers of fossil fuels. We asked them, could you fund our research? You guys have the weapons. And they said, well, did you know that every naval base is at sea level? And sea level is rising. So if you want to help us work on that, we'll give you money, but not on the effects of nuclear weapons. And we asked the Department of Energy, it makes the bombs, and Homeland Security. None of them wanted to fund us. So the military has very specific interests, but not on this.
I think
A small breakthrough in terms of U.S. government funding on this. There is going to be a study paid for by the government and done by the National Academy of Sciences about the likelihood of nuclear war, which was commissioned by Congress this past year. And that's a real breakthrough to have this kind of a study being produced that looks at how likely it is that we will actually have such a war.
Yeah, and in addition to that, the last National Defense Authorization Act required that the National Academy of Sciences does a study on the environmental impacts of nuclear war. That's in the last one that was just passed in December. They have 18 months to do it, and the House put it into the law, and the Senate didn't take it out. So and the military is supposed to work with them. So we hope that in the 1980s, the National Academy of Sciences produced a study on nuclear winter. It was very influential. And Brian and I were trying to get them to do it in the past. We talked to the president of the National Academy of Sciences. It never happened, but now Congress has mandated it.
And also, I think the point that you made in your presentation about the young generation you brought into your work is very important, because I think at some point, beyond the fact that most of the folks here are of a certain age, it is very important that you continue to do that kind of, bringing in, Alan, the younger generation.
Yeah, I worry whether it's going to tarnish their careers, whether it'll make them radioactive. I don't know, but when I did that, I was just thinking. I looked at that picture of us from a year ago. I said, when we did this, we were their age. So, but
I think if I
But
like
go ahead, Alan.
no, I think what we do is climate modeling and crop modeling, and this applies to global warming, to geoengineering, it's useful for climate science in general. The first calculations of nuclear winter allowed climate models to take account of particles in the atmosphere, which they didn't do very well then. And so it pushes science forward. So I think that they can still do very useful things once they've solved this problem.
It's so provocative for the US to have nuclear weapon carrying aircraft carriers off the coast of China, to have US and NATO troops up against the Russian border, a country that's been invaded from the West 3 times. This is insanity. We need to cooperate with those countries to solve these global problems, whether they be pandemics, nuclear weapons, climate change.
Well, when Carl Sagan wrote his only science fiction book called Contact, which was later made into a movie, I walked up to him, I said, Carl, the thing I liked about it the most was you had the Russians and the Americans cooperating in space together. But that's a fantasy. That's never going to happen. So if the US astronauts were getting to the space station for the last decade on Russian rockets, and we cooperate with them on that. So there's a lot of cooperation already going on. The situation is better than it used to be. Still, from the military point of view, you're absolutely right. They're really afraid of being invaded and being surrounded. So that's really part of the problem.
Well, to both you and Ira, keep up the good work. It's important.
And Frank, you've planted a lot of seeds, Mr. Jackson, and I think we all do. And what doesn't seem to take now will take later. I hope that you'll keep, Alan, a next steps list of the rejections that you've had, and we can figure out why down the road. We will have successes, and I know you will have many more to come. I do think that keeping your list of next steps is an important aspect of your work, and thank you all very much.
All right, thank you.
Again, thanks to all of you for participating today, and to Alan for his presentation. I think we are actually coming up to a hard stop when we need to close the session. And I think it's great that people wanted to stay on for extra time, and there's obviously a great deal of energy and desire to deal with this problem. So please, all of you, continue the great work that you're all doing. If you're not part of the Back from the Brink campaign, please do visit the website preventnuclearwar.org so we can all work on this together. Thanks so much.